without further ado, I'll hand over to the chair of our final panel for the day, Ruska Jayasuriya from IOM.
Thanks, Alan, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you all to the fourth and final panel for today. It's a panel in which we're going to explore some of the most pressing issues in our region. So the Asia Pacific, so human trafficking, climate mobility, labour mobility, and the challenges that we face in terms of irregular migration in the region. So we're really fortunate to have with us a wonderful lineup of speakers. We have Henrietta McNeil and Ryan Edwards from ANU, Chris Richter from IOM, and Antje Misbach from Bielefeld University, which I now know how to pronounce. I'll introduce each speaker in turn before their presentation. And just like the other sessions, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after the presentation. So we really look forward to your questions and a really active discussion to finish up our day. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Henrietta McNeil-Stowers, who is a research fellow in the Department of Pacific Affairs at ANU. We're very fortunate to have Henrietta speaking with us today about recent work that looks at the literature on the impact of natural and humanitarian disasters on irregular migration in the Bali Process region. Thank you, Henrietta.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Rasika and Alan and the Migration Hub for having me today. Today I'm spruiking some work that actually Rasika, Alan, Svea and Henrik and I worked on and was released earlier this year. If you haven't seen it out there, you can get some copies for yourself. It's a report titled Literature Mapping Impact of Natural and Humanitarian Disasters on Irregular Migration and Irregular Labour Migration in the Bali Process region. So this was work commissioned by the Department of Home Affairs for the Bali Process Regional Support Office, in which we were really trying to inform some of those regional discussions in the Bali Process region, which, as you can see, kind of spreads across a lot of Asia and the Pacific. So we were looking mostly at irregular migration as it pertained to climate and humanitarian disasters and irregular labour migration in that region. What we did was we took 179 academic and grey sources, so international organisation reports, NGO documents, policy documents, those types of things, and analysed them for kind of key themes in terms of the two issues of humanitarian irregular migration and irregular labour migration. And the period was between 2019 and 2024. So if there's anything more recent in the 2025 period that you've seen, I would love to hear it, but it's unfortunately not made it into the report. So in terms of climate-induced irregular migration and displacement, people who are really into these ideas, I'm sure, will be very well versed in many of these themes. What we were seeing was what was coming up time and time again in terms of the reports and academic articles and books that we were reading. So it's probably not a shock to many that climate change amplifies challenges like gender inequalities, human security, and of course migration. What we wanted to point out from the literature was that most climate mobility is actually internal rather than irregular. So I know there's a lot of media discourse about concerns about huge amounts of climate-induced migration crossing borders, but actually the evidence says that most climate-related mobility is internal to countries. The key drivers of irregular migration in terms of climate-induced mobility are actually very similar to any other drivers of irregular migration: lack of livelihoods, poor economic conditions, limited migration pathways, and these intensify climate displacement. We found that effective policy must address the root causes of climate migration and irregular pathways. In both the cases of humanitarian disasters and irregular migration and labour migration, we found that the more restrictive policies actually created irregular migration. So that's something to think about when building policy. One of the key issues that came up in the literature was the definitions around climate migrants and climate mobilities. It was very clear in the literature that there is an absence of legal definitions of climate migrants. And we all know there are issues around the 1951 Refugee Convention, for example, which is why the terminology climate refugees is completely ineffective and incorrect. But those terminologies also reflect vulnerabilities, and they can be securitized, as we've already talked about this morning. There's a lot of kind of sometimes anti-immigrant sentiment, and the use of the word refugees actually can exacerbate some of that securitization, particularly when it comes to climate displacement. Therefore, the literature suggests the use of the word climate mobilities, reflecting diverse migration patterns. So as I said, those can be both internal and cross-border, and also it reflects the choice and agency of individuals to make decisions about climate pathways, and I know we'll talk about climate pathways soon, but it reflects the fact that some people don't want to move, and the issues around migration with dignity. So climate mobilities is the preferred terminology. The other thing we did for this report was highlight some of those key research gaps. So if there are any wannabe PhD students in the room, there's a whole lot of key literature gaps in here that are useful to cover if you are looking for a new project. We also know that climate change displaces more people than conflict internationally in the Asia-Pacific region, and they have intersecting drivers. The majority of climate migration occurs in the Asia-Pacific region, in our region. And of course, small island states, particularly in the Pacific Islands, are highly impacted. Internal migration, of course, dominates, and cross-border migration is less common, but increasing. Those drivers can be sudden onset, so high impact disasters, and they're increasing in frequency, particularly in places like Vanuatu, or slow onset changes such as salinisation, drought. And of course, there is issues around conflict more in the Asia region than the Pacific region. We know that in the case of many irregular migration issues, economic and environmental pressures amplify these vulnerabilities. And of course, there's issues around trapped and stranded populations. So when we're thinking about labour mobility, as Ryan will talk about, what does that mean if there is a disaster in country while someone is out of the country? What does it mean if someone was trying to get home because they've just finished their job and can't get back because there's a disaster? But it also might have positive impacts. It means about sending remittances or chainsaws to be able to deal with the impacts of disasters. And we know that there are innovative frameworks, and I really hope our colleague from IOM will talk about the innovative frameworks from Fiji, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu in terms of planned relocations. There are risks without safe pathways being in place. We know that mass arrivals are unlikely, particularly in the Pacific Islands region. Some excellent research out of the University of Auckland, which says that mobility occurs gradually at the household or community scales. There's no such thing as this, which is talked about in the media, but this potential for mass migration due to climate-induced migration. These crisis narratives often lead to restrictive policies, which, as I said, actually create irregular migration. So yeah, that has a cyclic effect. And these lack of regular pathways do increase reliance on smugglers and risks of exploitation, including trafficking, and we saw forced marriage in the case of Vanuatu. And I hope Anya might talk a little bit about those risks. We also know that vulnerable populations, children, women, people with disabilities, also face heightened risks. And therefore, and this is in the case of both humanitarian disasters and labour irregular migration, but rights-based approaches are really essential to supporting safe, dignified migration and to preventing exploitation. There is a need for flexible climate mobility options. I won't go into the details, but there are many different pathways possible that are used by countries within the Bali Process region. And I'm going to take this opportunity, sorry, Alan, to spruik another migration hub briefing, which my colleagues, Dr. Liam Moore and Dr. Tina Newport, have written with myself on changing migration policy for a changing climate. And we've designed a typology of climate mobility pathways that are possible, and it's based with agency and protection in mind. So again, if you don't have a copy of that, please grab one from out there or use the QR code. In the case of irregular labour migration, it's a strong reminder to remember that irregular labour migration constitutes a very small share of global migration. Again, the media tends to overblow these things. And even within legal pathways, exploitation risks do persist. And that's because of gaps in regulation, therefore loopholes and things that people can exploit and be exploited by. Therefore, ensuring employer compliance, business reporting, fair recruitment, and closing those loopholes is really critical when thinking about how to protect migrants from exploitation. We noticed that the research, the literature and the academic focus, as well as the NGO focus, has really shifted from repatriation and prosecution towards thinking about modern slavery and supply chain management and governance. And again, that rights-based approach is really critical. Some of the trends in the irregular labour migration literature were unsurprisingly about COVID and how that decreased migration, but actually increased the reliance on smugglers. The issues of transit states that are becoming de facto destination states, so people are becoming stuck in transit, and then there's risks of their exploitation there. And that's because of increasingly restrictive policies, both in destination countries and in transit countries. We're also seeing multi-directional smuggling, so people being able to come and go through those channels. We're seeing digital nomadism really increase. That it was obviously brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, and people have found more flexibility in their workplaces. But we're also thinking about things like scam centres, which are becoming more prevalent in Asia, but also we're seeing them in Palau in the Pacific as well. And there's re-migration. So there are issues around return and reintegration and making sure that stigma and criminalisation really don't affect reintegration outcomes, and that people are supported in a culturally sensitive way. And of course, technology. Social media is always a complex issue, but it is used for recruitment and trafficking, although it can have positive impacts in terms of opportunities for awareness and support for survivors of trafficking. We see increased human rights risks in irregular migration, of course, rights violations, abuse, and I want to throw this to Rasika at some point, but particularly around children's vulnerabilities. I hope we can have a discussion about that later, and undocumented children which face the risks of trafficking, child labour and other lacking services. There's often corruption involved. There's a lot of literature on that. Prosecution challenges. Every government is always looking at the best ways in which prosecution can be undertaken, and the limitations around that. And of course, the need for regularisation efforts, and back to return and reintegration, as I said before. That's probably all I can cover in about 10 minutes, so I will leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Henrietta, for sharing those insights. I think we can all see that the issues that Henrietta's covered really lay a great contextual foundation for what this panel is going to discuss. So next we'll hear from Chris Richter, who is IOM's Regional Migration, Environment and Climate Change Specialist based in Bangkok with IOM's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. We're very lucky to have Chris join us here today in person to share with us his expertise and insights on climate mobility in the Pacific context. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Rasika, for the introduction. It's definitely a pleasure to be here back in Canberra. It's been a while since I've been around, so nice to be part of this conversation. I will touch on some similar themes to what Henrietta outlined at the start of her presentation around the links between migration, the environment, and climate change. But I just want to sort of start with this broad question about how can we better manage migration amidst growing climate risks? Now, this question is very much at the heart of what IOM does, both in this region, in Asia Pacific, and globally as well, in terms of our responses to climate change. And it's an important question for us because in a lot of the conversations about how we as societies should respond to climate change impacts, a lot of the focus is, quite rightly, I should say, on things like climate change mitigation, addressing carbon emissions, how to leverage new and emerging technologies to meet those mitigation goals and so on. But for IOM as a sort of humanitarian and development actor, it's important for us, I think, to think about the impacts of climate and environmental change on ordinary people, right? Because the impacts of climate change, whether we're talking about storms or floods or drought or rising seas, these aren't just issues in terms of their impacts on infrastructure or on economic output or what have you. They affect lives as well, right? And people move, sometimes by choice or sometimes because they feel like they have no choice. Now, this question is also particularly important in the Asia-Pacific region, which, as some of you might know, is the most disaster-affected region globally. So we're talking about over 7 billion people across this region having been impacted by climate and environmental factors since 1970, which is more than certainly in other parts of the world. And floods alone account for over half of these events. And while disasters do affect everyone, they don't affect everyone equally, as Henrietta was sort of saying. Least developed countries and small island developing states are, of course, bearing the heaviest burden of these sorts of challenges. Now, while that's already sort of a little bit confronting, the situation is only getting worse, actually. And in the past 50 years, for example, environmental hazards have increased roughly sixfold on average, and floods in particular have become 11 times more frequent. Now, we're also starting to see more cascading risks where different hazards impact different places at the same time. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, a lot of the countries in this region were dealing with floods and cyclones and so on at the same time as they were grappling with the global health emergency. Now, the Asia and the Pacific region is also expected to exceed global averages on several measures of climate impact. So we're looking at things like higher costs from flooding on infrastructure, greater GDP losses from heat and humidity, and more people being exposed to deadly heat waves. And these impacts aren't abstract, right? They affect jobs, they affect homes, they affect health, and they shape decisions about mobility outcomes and mobility patterns as well. Now, at the same time, as all of this is happening, the region is also falling behind on climate-related sustainable development goals. So rising emissions, fossil fuel dependence, and growing consumption are driving these sorts of patterns. So while the climate crisis is deepening, our responses to it are just not keeping pace, essentially. So when you put all of this together, and I'm sorry, it sounds like a bit of a grim outlook, so I do apologize for that. But you start to see that the conditions are being put in place whereby more and more people may be forced to move both now and in the future as well. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which, as you may know, is the main UN body responsible for assessing the evidence on climate change, has outlined fairly comprehensively that climate hazards like extreme weather and slow onset changes are driving migration and displacement patterns globally and are very much shaping what those patterns look like. And this includes by affecting livelihoods, making it harder for people to stay where they are. Now, in terms of what this movement looks like in Asia and the Pacific, between 2008 and 2024, there are around 330 million disaster displacements across the region, and this was over 2/3 of the global total for that period. And displacement doesn't just mean losing a home; it can mean losing a community, culture, mental health, and stability, and so on as well. In the Pacific, the numbers are, of course, smaller, but the impacts can be quite significant nonetheless. In smaller island nations, for example, even a few thousand displacements can affect a large proportion of the population. And you'll note from this graph as well that Australia is actually the second most impacted country in the region, which I think is a good reminder of the fact that these sorts of challenges affect all countries and not just developing countries as well. Now, some 199 cases of planned relocation have also been identified across the region, although this is likely to be somewhat of an undercount, to be honest. Now, while that might seem like a small number, we have to keep in mind that planned relocation is considered an absolute last resort measure. It can have significant socioeconomic, cultural implications for the communities that are affected, and it requires significant and long-term financial resources in order to essentially implement relocation in a way that does not impact negatively on the communities affected. So the fact that close to 200 different communities across the region have taken the decision to move, I think speaks a lot about the challenges that are already being faced at the local level as well. And it's one other, I think, important point to note about this question of planned relocation is that we often talk about it in the context of small island developing states, but the reality is that larger countries across the region are also very much impacted by this as well. To come back to the Australian context, for example, Australia does actually have some experience with relocation. I mean, many of you will probably remember the 2011 floods that affected southeast Queensland, including the Lockyer Valley outside of Toowoomba and Brisbane itself. And in Grantham, a town that was especially impacted, the local council actually proposed moving the entire town to safer ground nearby. And part of the goal for that was really to keep the community together and to preserve social ties and identity, noting that Grantham was a very small place. And they were concerned that if people just moved away, that would essentially kill the town. And so the Grantham Development Scheme was developed to help make that happen. And it's sort of an interesting example, I think, of how relocation can be done with dignity and care as well. Now, one other point I sort of wanted to highlight is that when we're talking about these issues of climate mobility or the links between migration, the environment, and climate change, we don't just mean talking about the impacts of climate and environmental factors as drivers of migration. It's also important to think about, first of all, the role of migration as a potentially positive adaptation strategy, but also to think about how migration and migrants themselves can help address climate change issues in the first place. So there is some research, for example, that shows demand for green skills is essentially outpacing supply. And in Australia, the clean energy workforce needs to grow from around 53,000 to 84,000 by 2050 in order to meet the government's net zero goals, for example. And that's according to Jobs and Skills Australia. So it's important to think about the role that migration could play in helping to meet that sort of future demand for green skills as well. Now, as Henrietta also mentioned, the Pacific has very much been leading this conversation on climate mobility and how to respond to it. And countries have developed different frameworks to address the issue, including the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility, which was not only one of the first of its kind anywhere in the world, it's also one of the more comprehensive regional frameworks to address this topic. What's also interesting about it is that being endorsed by the Pacific Islands Forum, it includes countries like Australia and New Zealand, which is sort of makes it a little bit different from other similar frameworks around the world. As was mentioned, at the national level as well, some countries like Fiji, Solomon Islands, and so on are developing standalone policies related to planned relocation, for example. PNG is developing a policy related to internal displacement. And other countries like Palau as well are, instead of developing standalone policies, trying to integrate these sort of climate mobility issues into their national adaptation plans and related frameworks and so on. Now, these are all really important and quite significant advances in sort of the regional and global discussions on climate mobility, but a lot more is still needed if we're going to really tackle this issue effectively. And this brings us back, I guess, to the question about, how can we manage migration in the context of increasing climate risks? And for IOM, the answer really lies in taking a comprehensive and nationally led approach that addresses the full spectrum of mobility in this context. So whether we're talking about migration, displacement, planned relocation, indeed irregular migration and other forms of mobility in this context as well. And this means taking action in sort of three broad areas of action. The first being to support people to stay where they are, which is first and foremost what we hear from most communities in terms of what they want to do. They want to stay in their homes, especially in the Pacific, where people have very strong cultural connections to their homes. And this is where, you know, policies and interventions related to climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction and resilience building and so on really come into the equation. The next focus area would be to look at helping people to move, if that is something that they indeed want to do. And this is sort of where the links with labour migration really come to the fore as well. The Fallapelli Union between Australia and Tuvalu has sort of been highlighted as a potentially interesting model to look at in that context. But there are many other mechanisms potentially that we could use there as well. This could also be about looking at again, how to mobilise the contributions of diaspora and so on to support development and climate change action back at home as well. And then the third area is looking at supporting people already on the move. And this is where, you know, we want to provide humanitarian support to displaced populations, but also to think about the impacts of climate change on existing migrant workers in terms of, you know, how that impacts their working conditions, their ability to earn an income and livelihood and so on. Now, in the Pacific, many of these sorts of solutions have been already integrated in regional and national policy frameworks, including the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility. But as we look ahead, what we need to be doing now is really to embed these sorts of approaches in countries that have yet to develop governance mechanisms for climate mobility, but also to accelerate implementation in countries that have already taken that step and do have frameworks in place. But this really requires us to mobilise dedicated resources specifically to look at climate mobility. And so IOM has been doing a lot of work in the context of the UNFCCC discussions and COPs and everything like that to really make the case for governments to provide dedicated funding to address climate mobility issues in that context. We also need to think about strengthening the capacity of regional bodies like the Pacific Islands Forum, SPC and SPREP and so on, to oversee and take forward these issues in a sustainable way. And finally, we need to look at strengthening partnership and learning across the region, including with countries like Australia, which has, I think, some quite valuable lessons and experiences to share. And these are all very much priorities for IOM in the region as well. But I think it's certainly, you know, areas where all of you as policymakers and researchers and donors and so on can also make a difference. And we're very much open to collaborating and look forward to sort of discussing these sorts of issues with you. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. I think the issues that you've raised really help us get a really good sense of the environmental and climate-induced related factors that are really shaping the migration context in our region. And it's a terrific segue into our next presentation, which will look at one of the other major issues shaping migration in our region, which is that of labour mobility. For this, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Ryan Edwards, who is the Deputy Director of the Development Policy Centre at the Crawford School of Public Policy and the Centre's lead on the Australian Government's Pacific Research Program. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you. Everyone hop up for a sec. Oh, it's late in the day. Come on, hop up. Stretch legs. Wake up a bit. Now go back up. Now you can sit down. Hey, first. Okay. Again? Oh, hey. We've done like some movements, but really cool. Please, you can all hear me okay? On the mic, I don't need to mess with this. Good. Please don't blame Alan if you were here last year. I was a phone-in. He didn't mean to have me twice, but hopefully you'll all forgive him. My name's Ryan. Quick disclosure at the start, I'm with the Development Policy Centre at the ANU and part of the Economics faculty here at Crawford. And since 2019, all the work that we've done at our centre on Pacific migration has been generously supported by DFAT. So huge thank you to the Labour Mobility Branch there for their continued support. They don't, as you can probably see from what I'm about to say, they don't really have much of a veto or a say over what I get to say. And that's the way we all like it. But yeah, they're continuing to support us at least until June next year. So yeah, big thanks to them for that. Last year I got up here and I spoke about 3 points, but those points had loads of sub-points. The first one was, as we're moving towards a situation of more Pacific integration in terms of labour mobility and trade and other things, what's the situation of Pacific Islanders in Australia like? Then I spoke about the evolution and the rise of modern Pacific labour mobility as it has sort of grown out of the seasonal worker program to what we see today. For people who've been working on this for a long time like myself, if you were to look back at the Pace of Plus negotiations in the early and mid 2000s, you would never have been able to predict where we're at today with this stuff. And then I drew upon a couple of lessons for Australian migration policy from the successes that we've seen so far on particular Pacific pilots, which are quite different from the rest of our migration program in a range of really important substantive ways. If those things sound of interest, the slides are up on my website, so I'll say go read them, but I promised I'm not going to give the same update. So what's happened since then? Just zooming just on, I'm not just going to talk about labour mobility. Labour mobility is often associated with circular migration and temporary migration, and we're getting to a point with Pacific Australia migration where time's up on that. We're moving beyond that. We're talking about genuine mobility and more freedom and permanent movements and growing the diaspora here. But on Palm itself, the biggest issue for Palm in the media over the last couple of years post-COVID was this issue of absconding and disengaging. For those not familiar with the scheme, it's people applying for protection visas. For people familiar with the immigration program will know that this isn't a Palm-specific problem. Student visas, visitor visas. Palm visas, in fact, don't have a higher rate of TPV application than any of these other visas, which makes the fact that Palm disengagement and application rates falling from 10% at its peak down to 1 point something now, pretty remarkable. I don't know how or why this has happened. I found this out when I was in Solomons 2 weeks ago, but that's quite a remarkable achievement. A second thing that's happened with Palm that is quite interesting is a family accompaniment pilot. A lot of the social issues in the region were due to longer stay visas, the Palm Long, formerly the PLS, separating families. And we've done a family accompaniment pilot, which by every metric has been a raging success. As I'll say at the end, we probably don't need that to be a pilot anymore. But on a slightly more critical side, coming out of COVID, we have rapid Palm growth. And the region would like to see that growth continue. They would like more opportunities. That growth is over. And the impacts of the 2023 reforms that have seen the Palm scheme become probably the most regulated visa program in the world are now coming to bite in some very interesting ways. They're becoming quite obvious when you go out and talk with both employers and workers themselves. Onto the permanent flows. The Pacific Engagement Visa, which was our first ever sort of visa lottery. There's lots of these in many other countries in the world, but we had to have special legislation passed for it to happening, and we've been sort of calling for something like this at our centre for a very long time. They were both, the 2024 and 25 ones were completed. I would argue pretty successfully, but people who were involved in it would say, there was a lot of teething challenges, and part of this is because from an intake perspective, we've never really had to make sure that the applications that we receive get through on the applicant side, right? If you don't submit a good application, then that's your problem to fix. Whereas, yeah, we've had to figure out how to manage that. And I'll give you some data on that shortly. The Falapeli agreement was touched on, and the 2025 ballot completed. Compared to PEV, the Falapeli was a raging success by almost any metric you can look at. And we've had additional agreements made with Nauru, Vanuatu and PNG, but the migration aspects of them, especially in PNG, are really still to be seen or pretty trivial. Today, I'll go through 3 things. First one, I did miss this morning because I couldn't get out of other meetings. So hopefully this has not been covered too much, but I'm going to give you a little bit of, I guess, we are very apolitical, but I'll give you some information that might help you think about the politics of this stuff. Then I'll talk temporary visas and what I just showed about the Palm scheme sort of being at a bit of a crossroads, and then some new data on the permanent programs. So we did a paper a little while ago. It was Alyssa's thesis. Alyssa is an absolute star, one of our Crawford Masters graduates that also worked for our centre. And this was a pretty comprehensive project. We saw this gap in the way that immigration attitudes have been looked at in the US and in Europe, and the normal polls that we would see in Australia. With all due respect to anyone from our friends at Scanlon or Lowy who may be in the audience here. But there's a challenge. When you're asking about migration, you kind of need to be specific. Otherwise, it'll pick up all kinds of different other things. So we thought we need to be more specific in what we ask on the type and the sources and lots of other things to try and really unpack attitudes a bit further. And what we did see was that there actually is nuance. So we did a survey to try and measure this in a way that had been done to global standards in economics and political science. We embedded some experiments in that with a view to try and test what actually changes people's views. And these were based around narratives around housing at the moment, surprise, surprise, but also around sort of correcting people's misbeliefs or where they don't quite have good information on the current flows and levels of particular types. And then a third part was integrating the Pacific into this to see whether there was something different going on. So these figures here show you for the broad program. The one on the top left won't surprise anybody. These are consistent with what happens when you talk about the general intake and the number of migrants you want to see in the country. And you'll note that most of these curves, they're going this way, right? They're slightly skewed to the right. However, for skilled and for students, much more positive picture. No one wanted a change in student visas. No one, not no one. Sorry, I'm getting too carried away. But for high skilled as well, people generally seem supportive of high skilled migration, which explains the long-standing bias towards it that we've had. However, let's turn to questions about Pacific migration in particular. The curves are shifting now to the right rather than the left. People tend to be more supportive of Pacific migration than the rest of the migration program. Questions are framed a tiny little bit differently, but those patterns are pretty clear to us. And this is for temporary, for permanent, and for these new mobility agreements. This was a nationally representative survey. The main study included 5,000 people, but because we had 4 experimental arms and a control, this is for the 1,000 in the control group. And as you see, active hostility towards more migration from the Pacific is actually pretty low. So vis-a-vis other types of migration, the politics around this are pretty okay. We can probably keep going in the direction that we have been going. What about what changes views? Well, when it comes to all other types of flows, narratives and stories really work. The positive, the negative, and the negative in particular, you see when you tell a negative story about the impact, people's views tend to go down. When you tell a positive, they tend to go up. And quantitative information only has a pretty small effect. But these narratives around housing they don't really do much when it comes to views to the Pacific. This could be because the number itself is very small, or because they're living in areas that are typically not dominated by housing concerns. However, whenever you do correct people's views on how many Pacific migrants are in Australia, people thought there were 3 times more than there really are. There's only actually a small number. The information does make a big effect on their views when the views were already pretty positive. So you can go read this paper. It's up online. I wanted to start with that because it sort of gives some context about the way things have been going and whether they could continue. We then did a piece looking at, well, on the domestic side of things, we don't really know much about how the PALM scheme and other Pacific visas affect domestic labour market outcomes. And the first order issue there really is domestic disemployment and wages, whether it's holding down domestic wages. So we decided to tackle this one using some of the data that was probably discussed this morning. If I had been in attendance, I would know, in PLIDA. So we used all of the individual tax returns and visa records via the data lab, and we use what's called a triple difference design. It's a really, really rich econometric strategy where you're comparing migrants within a particular area that's exposed in a particular occupation against others in similar occupations, and then the trends over time to unpack whether there is an effect of the program or not. And we don't really find any evidence on those most exposed workers that would be most likely to be affected. And these are some of the least mobile, lowest paid workers in the Australian economy. And when we tried to unpack why this is, it seems to be that a lot of these visa programs, at least the employer-sponsored ones, are predicated on this idea of labour shortages or skill shortages, which as an economist I've always been quite sceptical on because, well, you should just train more people or pay them more. But as it turns out, in the regions, so here we're plotting SA4's regions and the percent of people in agriculture in the period before the SWP was announced in population growth. These are areas that are having systematically much less population growth than the rest of the country. And then if you zoom out to the sector level, the number of farm workers domestically was steadily declining before that, when every other part of the labour force was growing. So it sort of smells like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck in this case. Now, onto the pump scheme. This is what we were studying. So that study I just showed focused on the growth period before the COVID craziness, because you don't really want to look at labour market effects of anything during COVID, given everything else that was going on. It's massively confounded. And as an economist, these are the things that keep me up at night. But if you stack on top the red and the light coloured here, you can see what basically happened to the growth of the PALM scheme leading up to around 2022 and 2023. Okay, so do that mentally in your head as to what happened. You can see which way that curve is going. However, more recently, the deed and guidelines that regulates employers was changed and reformed in June 2023. And what has happened to the lines since then from that previous trend? Any takers? Alan? We've had about a 25% reduction in the numbers of seasonal workers. The seasonal worker program was remarkably successful in the 2010s, and demand has fallen down since these reforms. It's been somewhat offset, as you can see, by the black line, which is total, by the longer stay visas, which are the ones that typically bring some of these social concerns about people being away from their family. But the seasonal options have been declining. And there could be many reasons for this. It could be the reform. It could also be that backpackers are back. Many reforms. But then in terms of where people are actually coming from, demand is not really faltering. There's still lots of workers that want to come. And then when you look across sending countries, the ones where you hear and see the concerns about people leaving, brain drain concerns, social concerns, these are the ones where we've got really high amounts of the working age population abroad. If I was to do this for working age men, these numbers would be almost double the size. So look, 30% of blokes in Tonga no longer in the country. And then, however, if you go down, you'll see that there's been a big change. Timor-Leste, Fiji, and Solomons, newcomers on the scheme. Big growth. Now if we split up by scheme, it used to be dominated by Tonga, Samoa, and Vanuatu. Vanuatu is still going very strong. However, Fiji, Solomons, and what did I just say? TL, and to a lesser extent PNG are all moving onto the scene. So employers are moving west to basically where the demand is still effectively very large and uncapped. And there's a lot of that. So there's been a big shift over time in where that is going. So there's a lot of competition on the sending side now, which wasn't so much the case before. And employers are sort of voting with their feet when things get difficult in sending countries. On to integration and permanent visas. I'm not keeping track of the time, and I was going to skip things, but I haven't. So for those of you that are not familiar with the PEV, it's been a long time coming. I won't talk about the history within the bureaucracy, because I'm not sure I'm allowed to or supposed to, but it does respond to calls for permanent pathways, greater worker flexibility, being able to move employers and be portable, and the interest to grow in the diaspora and deepen person-to-person links between Australia and the Pacific. 3,000 permanent visas a year, allocated by random ballot. It's skill neutral in theory. I say in theory because anyone can apply and sort of has an equal selection chance. But whether anyone applies, open question. If you're in a rural village in PNG, you're probably not applying. And then once you've been selected for the visa, your chance of being able to get a job in Australia to then secure the visa is absolutely non-random, right? There's some selection there going as well. So you need the job offer to apply. But once you then do get the visa and the job offer, you can then work for any employer. You can leave after a few days on the job if you don't like it, and you've got access to complete public services. These were major reforms to our visa system that don't really exist across a lot of other. There's normally a waiting list for public services and so forth. So it's quite unique in this regard. And then the Falapeli one is a little bit different. I say here security migration deal framed around climate change, but the framed around climate change part is pretty serious. Because there's aspects to the Falapeli deal that bring in this migration with dignity idea that was just talked about before. You don't need to have a job offer. It's really hard to apply for jobs in Australia from abroad, unless you're going through intermediaries or have networks. They've removed the age and the disability restrictions that exist on the other one, and it doesn't have this use it or lose it feature. You don't have to be present and move to the country. You can keep it effectively as an insurance policy. as it was intended. So how did it go? Well, only this year we have started to see very rapidly between April, July and now a climb up to actually granting all the visas near the quota. You can see apply for the visa and granted. So we're still not even, I mean, as of July, we're not even halfway of all of them being granted. And this was due to the issues on sort of the processing side largely. Conversion rates per country, you can kind of predict which ones would have had higher conversion rates, but yeah, Fiji's done pretty well, and then goes down accordingly. And compared to last year, Fiji had a really, really, really large number. So that's predictably fallen down. You don't keep entering a lottery every year if you're not going to win, or every week. But the other ones you can kind of see has been relatively stable. And what this means is that the total number has again grown this year. And yeah, so here's the data. I've got this, this will be up on the website if anyone needs to have a look. This is sort of fresh off the press from our good friends at Home Affairs in terms of the quota primary and secondary and the changes over time. Some countries have had a fall. And then some concluding remarks. So I'll slow down because Rasika's not going to cut me off just yet. I've got a few more things to say. So I said, can we go to 1%, beyond the 1%? This is not about inequality, or maybe it is about global inequality. But right now, temporary palm visas account for around 1% of all temporary visas in Australia, and there's an awful lot of them. And PEV visas also account for about 1% of permanent. Given all the rhetoric that you hear around Pacific integration and getting closer and getting more, I think we could probably and should do a bit better than 1%. But how? So palm is stagnating, as we saw. And there's a big review into it at the moment, and this review is appropriately looking at those settings and sort of, it's not quite going back to principles, but the review is welcome. But it doesn't need to be complicated if we want to go back towards sort of a bit more of a growth mindset. First one, we could probably end family separation now that we've done the pilot and evaluation. It's come out well. That's one. Two, there's area restrictions. This hits aged care and disability care the hardest, who are basically ready to move into the cities and elsewhere where there is demand. Right now, they're only in the regions. They've listed this for meat a long time ago, but they haven't lifted it for care. That's a first sort of low-hanging fruit. That would be very good and welcomed by the Pacific because they do want more skilled people coming. And there's probably other sectors where we might need workers here. First one that does come to mind would be building, trades, construction, houses. And this is one that, on talking to folks in the Pacific, people who were previously disengaging, they go and work with their families in Sydney on construction sites. Some of them are doing this anyway. And there's a lot of building happening back home. This is one where you would see some nice alignment. And the palm long jobs are an interesting one because the merger, where it turned into palm, sought to merge seasonal work and these longer stay 4-year ones that are full-time contracts that have a non-seasonal or casual component. But these are fundamentally different groups that have different aspirations, different outlooks, and meet long-term sort of labour market needs in Australia. So I'd argue that one size does not fit all there. And what about PEV? I think we could double it. It's pretty small. It's only 3,000. In the first instance, demand massively exceeds supply, and it's only a trivial share of our permanent intake. At the moment, we'd probably need to think and do some exciting research using PLIDA on really what the optimal settings are in terms of job search requirements versus and all of these changes that have been put in place. And lastly, I guess, because we've got some regional colleagues here, free movement is now on the PIF's agenda, but there's, I guess, big questions around what can we actually do rather than just talk about it. That we had remarks from the Secretary General at the Pacific Update. Solomon Islands took a free movement proposal together that was endorsed by the leaders in August. And there's some really practical immediate options. New Zealand's made serious changes to visa-free travel. We could at least match them. We can normally do better than the Kiwis, I think. You could have a business travel card and some longer term goals are basically keep doing what we're doing, I think. But hopefully, yeah, thank you. We can learn some more.
Thanks, Ryan, for sharing those invaluable insights with us. And I'm very certain that there will be some questions for you during the Q&A. So thank you. And just in the interest of time, we'll turn now to our final presentation, for which we're very fortunate to be joined by Professor Antje Misbach, who is Professor of Sociology at Neighbourhood University, specialising in the study of global migration and mobility, with her current work focusing on the maritime journeys of Rohingya from Myanmar and Bangladesh to Malaysia and Indonesia. Anja will speak today on the challenges of irregular migration in the context of the Andaman Sea. Thank you. Right, good afternoon, and thank you, Ellen, for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to direct some attention to what is happening in the Andaman Sea. I'm a sociologist and political anthropologist, so I promise you there won't be any graphs or tables from my side, just a couple of pictures on what's happening. I'm the person who does more classic anthropological field work, interviews with survivors and so on. So as we are here, this is just the start of the so-called new sailing season. It's usually between November and March that boats will start coming towards Indonesia and Malaysia. It's at the end of the monsoon, so to say. And I just give you a couple of numbers, what the volume is that we're looking at. And in 2023, there were about 41 boats with 4,490 people on board. However, quite a large number went missing or died at sea, never to be heard about again. And in relative numbers, that means that the Andaman Sea is a lot more deadly compared to, for example, the Mediterranean Sea, where we see, of course, a much higher volume of people crossing. Now, not everybody arrives in where they want to go. Some of them get intercepted on the way. Some manage to disembark, and at least for 2023, the majority came to Indonesia. You see other countries of destination, voluntary or not. In this year, in the first month of 2025, we have already seen 5 boats coming to Indonesia with about almost 700 people on board. What is very frightening is that not only that the number of people trying to look for protection by boat has gone up, but we also have seen since at least late 2023 that the number of local rejections in Indonesia and Malaysia has grown, and that's very much connected to mis- and disinformation campaigns online, hate speech, and also flavored a little bit by the electoral politics in Indonesia, I'd say. We've seen pushbacks. Countries usually don't like to admit that they're pushing back boats, but Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and India have been implicated, which means that this is disregard for the non-refoulement principle, to which also non-signatory states of the Refugee Convention are liable to. In some cases, even we have seen interceptions, for example, by Vietnamese commercial boats who handed over Rohingyas directly to the Myanmar Navy. So this is a very frightening development. Now, what about these journeys? We've been conducting interviews with survivors both in Indonesia and Malaysia, and what I find really unique about the journeys of the Rohingya is that they tend to be quite long. So usually 3 to 5 weeks, but there's been instances where people have been on a boat for 7 months. And you can imagine what that would be like out there in the heat, squashed together with dozens or hundreds of people, facing lack of food, dehydration, and frequent storms, and so on and so on. There are reasons why these journeys take so long, and it's not just the pure distance that people have to cover, but there are also frequent breakdowns. So the boats that are chosen are often described as unseaworthy, and it's more likely than not just one boat that people would take, but they tend to change. So in a way, we've seen an adjustment of the so-called smuggling or trafficking infrastructure. They would leave by a small boat to avoid arrest and detection, either in Bangladesh or increasingly also Myanmar. And then the biggest part of the journey they would probably spend on a larger boat. But when they come closer to Indonesia or Malaysia, then once again, they are being loaded onto a smaller boats. And so the delays that we see sometimes
if it's not for a breakdown or lack of fuel, are deliberate delays, either because those people who organize the journeys, they want to extort more money. So they would ask relatives or family members to pay a higher amount of money than has been agreed initially. But also it's sometimes having to wait until border control or so border patrols slow down in order to sneak in. Now, I've already mentioned some of the hardship that people suffer from, but I just want to underline here that people who survive these journeys, they tend to have like permanent health consequences. So it's not just they go off the boat when everything is fine, but I think it's worthwhile looking into the permanent damage or the long-term health damages that they experience. Now, as I said, this is the start of the new sailing season, and unfortunately, we already have seen a very tragic incident only 2 weeks ago in the beginning of November, close to the border of Malaysia and Thailand. There's been sinking reported. The few survivors said that altogether there were 300 people on board, but they have been divided up onto either 2 or 3 other boats. But there are no news about happened to these people. So, I mean, most likely we have to expect the worst. These deaths, they are very much debated in the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. But they're not necessarily, they don't function as a deterrent. It's not something that we can expect that would possibly slow down people or prevent them from attempting. And as I said before, the facilitators, call them smugglers, call them traffickers, they have very much adjusted to these deterrence mechanisms, for example, by using smaller boats to sneaking people into Indonesia or Malaysia. They are now probably more likely to use completely clandestine entries rather than before, when they were relying, for example, on service from the UNHCR or IOM. So a number of people that we talked to had no contact with these international organizations and spent a very short time in transit in Indonesia. Another very worrying development is that Indonesia has started to criminalize rescuers. Before that, fishermen, when they came across Rohingya boats in distress, would not only hand over food and fuel and water, but often bring people ashore against the orders of the Indonesian security forces. However, in 2020, we've seen the first case where these 3 people on the picture have been indicted and basically prosecuted, and they got the minimum prison terms that are prescribed under Indonesian law, which is 5 years. There have been additional cases since then, and some people end up with 6 or 7 years in jail because this act of rescuing people from a drowning ship, which is compulsory under international maritime law, is being defined or reframed as people smuggling. So what fishermen are nowadays supposed to do is not to intervene, not to bring people into Indonesian waters or ashore, but to inform the search and rescue authorities. Unfortunately, the search and rescue operations that are taking place in Indonesia and Malaysia tend to be slow, delayed. There's, of course, a lack of funding, but I guess more so probably also a lack of political will to do so. 10 years ago, in the first so-called Andaman Sea crisis, the countries bordering the Andaman Sea had actually the plan to form a regional search and rescue task force, but it has, to my knowledge, not materialized. Now, what happens if there's no search and rescue? And here's a picture from March 2024. A boat with 150 people sank, not entirely, so you can see people clinging onto the hull. And they had to wait 2 days and 2 nights for the Indonesian search and rescue authorities to come and pick them up. But by that time, only 69 had actually survived. And again, these pictures had been in the social media for days because fishermen have been passing by, but they didn't dare to interfere because they were too afraid of being prosecuted as people smugglers. Now, the triggers and drivers, I probably don't have to talk so much about it. There are people here in the room who probably have been to Cox's Bazar fairly recently, but we have about 20 refugee camps in Bangladesh. Nowadays, they're occupied with roughly 1.3 million people from Myanmar, the Rohingya. The exodus, the mass exodus took place in 2017. That means these people have been languishing in these camps for 8 years. There are no permanent housings allowed, as you can see. Whenever there are floods or you easily also see like landslides, there are frequent fires that break out. But probably what has made the situation a lot more devastating is that international aid has been cut down in the last 2 years. There's widespread violence, and particularly worrying is the forced conscription that are conducted by the Arakan army, but also on behalf of the Myanmar army. So that's one of the reasons why people would opt for maritime journeys. It's to escape the situation in the camp, because for the time being, a return to Myanmar is probably out of question. Now, are people actually safe in these so-called destination countries, Indonesia and Malaysia? Well, probably not. I mean, first of all, once they survive the trips, they have accrued massive debts. For women, often that means that they will have to get married. Sometimes there's a spouse that has sponsored their trip, but increasingly we also see young girls and women departing without a very specific promise of marriage, but rather they will marry the highest bidder. But having accrued such enormous debts, of course, makes people extremely exploitable to any one around. In Malaysia, particularly, people have to fear arrest and detention, and the reason behind that is that the UNHCR is very slow and very much behind registrations. Being registered as an asylum seeker would provide people with like some form of identification, which might spare them, in the best of cases, being arrested. This picture actually is from a breakout from a detention center. Rohingya, in collective action, have tried to run away, but they had to cross a highway, and while trying to do so, a few of them got hit by cars, and eventually they were all rounded up and taken back into detention. So yes, I think we can probably leave some questions open, but I think what to do, I mean, saving lives should probably be the highest priority. Of course, this enemy is outside of the Australian search and rescue zone, but at least there could be a bit more support for those countries whose SAR zone the Andaman Sea borders. Of course, also more support for the UNHCR and the relevant organizations would be very advisable. These organizations have themselves met extreme funding cuts and are predicted for the next year to see even further cuts in funding. So I guess anticipate more movements, be prepared. That's what we are most likely going to see. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Antje. I think your presentation brings us full circle and ties really nicely back to the first presentation on the panel by Henrietta on risks associated with irregular migration in our region. We now have just over 20 minutes for questions. So I'd like to open the floor first. Do we have a Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the presentations. In this case, my focus would be with Ryan's presentation. The reason is that I work in the PALM scheme, and that's my job every day. So I deal with employers and workers and everything, and the guidelines and everything. So I was very interested in hearing your presentation. I have noticed, yes, that the regulations have become a bit more difficult for employers. Did I understand well you saying that, at least in your opinion, the main reason why we're seeing that decrease in especially the short-term program is because of the DDAN guidelines? They are more restrictive now. I worked for a year or so in the seasonal worker program for 2 years, and then in the PALM scheme, and there is a difference. So is that because you said that there might be different factors, but would you say that that is the main issue, that if you had a hand to, if the government was going to do whatever you wanted, would you recommend just changing the guidelines, or what is, can you explain more on that? Thank you.
Can I answer with one word? And that's yes. I think yeah. But no, I can talk a little bit more about it. Yeah, this is one of those things where, I mean, we can get, I don't know if it's working well, we can get more data and we can go more forensically through it, but I forget, one of my former colleagues, there's Danny, he's a British macroeconomist, but he used to give the example of instead of also analysing the data, you also just need to go out there and talk to people. And as someone that would have worked on the scheme for a long time, you really only just need to go out there and talk to employers that have been doing this since the beginning in 2005 and ask them how things change and what the costs are and what the calculus are and whether they use backpackers or palm workers or start sponsoring people for 457s instead of putting them on the palm scheme. And it becomes blind as day. If you start also then looking at the systems that they have to deal with, it'll probably give you flashbacks to when you were a student having to deal with the likes of Centrelink at times and so forth, and you felt like the government really resented you and trying to do it. Like it's really, yeah, I think the approach is to take that sort of employer-centric lens to it, right? Because it's demand-driven. The only way to rescue it is to come back in from that angle, I think.
Sorry, but so what aspects specifically would you change in the guidelines? Could you be more specific?
I mean, have you read the guidelines? I'm half joking. They're extremely long. They're extremely long and they're extremely complicated and a very, very complex document that even with a PhD, it's hard to understand them all and figure out which bit applies where. Imagine being a farmer and having to do the same. So there's many, many ways, but accommodation is an obvious area, having to have rooms booked for people months before they arrive in regional Australia and bonds paid and rents paid. There's just things that don't pass what you would call the pub test when you go out and try and implement these things in the field. And even we did some analysis of, so we did one of our main project at the moment is the Pacific Labour Mobility Survey, and it was during COVID. So this was when things were worse, right? But we asked everybody, how many hours did you work last week? And there's going to be a natural amount of people when you ask that to everyone in the labour force that will report not too many and so forth. But there wasn't a huge difference between palm short and palm workers in that response there. The tail of those that were getting fewer hours overlapped each other really neatly, which suggested to me that then this concern about not getting enough hours, which was one of the 3 welfare flaws put in place now that overlap each other a lot. So that could be simplified into one as an example, but that one there seems, I annoyed a few people by saying this, but that seemed to me to be a bit of a solution in search of a problem, that it had come from the fact that there was such rapid growth. It wasn't an intensity or a sort of a systematic change in things getting worse. It was due to the conditions that we were having in the field at the time, due to COVID, due to deployments, due to a bunch of other things, which I don't think were perhaps considered enough when developing them. But I could go on for days about that, so please.
It's for days, Rowan.
And I shouldn't, yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah. Yep. Just here, please.
I think I'll just talk.
Yep.
I think an earlier presenter, Brian, talked about program, if I understood correctly, as an exploitative program in the context of the transaction costs to enter the program, and then the imposition of Australian tax that they had to pay for benefits they couldn't actually benefit from Australia. So I'm just kind of curious with all of the research that you've done, where you're landing on the partner program in terms of is it exploitation, as we sometimes see in the press, maybe you land on that sort of argument.
Yeah, it's been coming a lot up in the press of that. Anyone that has read our stuff or would like to go off and read it will probably guess that I don't come down firmly in that camp. Even before the reforms, it's highly, highly regulated. People do relative to, we have trafficked people from the Pacific into Australia in the past. It's a very different era today. People want to do it. There's demand. It's incredibly popular in the Pacific. So demonizing it rather than listening to the bulk of workers and families on their experiences here, I find quite paternalistic. Are those issues real? Does it happen? Yes. With an employer-sponsored visa, you're going to have this problem, but you run into the politics of it pretty quickly. For temporary visas, it's much better than the alternatives. Unregulated workers, people who are not on visas, people who are on backpacker visas, it's better than every alternative we have so far. It's sort of like what best system we have apart from all the others type trope. But in that sense, it is the strongest by far. And most of the issues around the exploitation, if you sort of unpack them when they're raised, a lot of them do relate to the absconding issue. Once people are off the PALM scheme is when most of the problems start to happen. And yeah, but most people we've spoken to are really happy. Dive into the deductions data, and most deductions are not a big share. People are saving an awful lot and sending an awful lot back home. They're incredibly frugal here. It's overwhelmingly a good news story. So yeah.
Thank you.
I think there's always room to improve, but we're never going to get perfect compliance, or we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, I don't think. Yeah.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, the lady in the right. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Ask you, tell us whether what is the percentage of achieved in these kind of maritime journeys, and what the experience is.
Well, thank you very much. I don't have the precise number of children, but we usually know that nowadays it's 60% women and children. So the majority of people on board tend to be not male, but women and children, so to say. When you meet people who have freshly arrived, they're pretty young, and often they would not travel with family, but it's often that they can only afford to send one person at a time. So you have the issue of unaccompanied minors, but also, yeah, underage girls. Language problems are, of course, a big problem to navigate. They are very dependent on other people from the boat, for example, who speak Malay or Indonesian to help them, specifically when it comes to onward migration. Indonesia is not supposed to be the final destination, but only a transit point, and they need to continue. Well, we have heard reports about violence on board of those boats when people, for example, demand more water or more food. Sometimes they get hit by the crew. The crew often doesn't tend to be Rohingya, but they can be either Bengali people, or they can be people from Myanmar. So there's of course also quite a power hierarchy between the crew and the people. But I mean, people are traumatized. I mean, there's no question about this. What they get to see out in the water is devastating. I mean, there's a lot of suicides actually where people can't take it any longer, and they would, for example, jump board, and that happens in front of people's eyes. But also the way, for example, the dead bodies are being disposed of. Like some children have seen both their parents or their main guardian die in front of their eyes and being thrown into the water. So, I mean, that's all like that they will have to live with for the rest of their lives.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question and for the response. I think children are often overlooked in migration policy and discourse. And before we move on to the next question, I might just take that opportunity to throw to a UNICEF colleague who Alan mentioned we have in the room today, which is very fortunate, just to make a few comments on that, and then we'll move on to the next question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for throwing it over to me. I think Ryan has rightly mentioned a point of ending family separation. I think that is a key point in terms of what are the unintended, I want to emphasize that is unintended outcome and impact on children and family left behind, particularly for those kind of PALM schemes or migration schemes. UNICEF, I'm speaking on behalf of my colleagues from the Pacific. So they have done research, quantitative research in the community in 4 Pacific Island countries, particularly focusing on what are the impact on children left behind. And the research have highlighted a few key issues with neglected care, with nutritional neglect of children, with emotional distress of children, and even school dropouts. So I mean, I want to say that it's unintended, but also it shouldn't be unexpected. Because of policy-driven labor migration, it's not new. I mean, we can trace it back to like modern history. Back in after World War II, there are some migration, policy-driven migration in Europe, and then we see migration from East Asia to East Asia, and we see migration from Romania to other European countries. We see domestic migration because of labor migration between urban and rural areas in China as well. So we've seen it before. So it shouldn't be news to us, and it shouldn't be a surprising impact for children. And we just need to, knowing that it would actually happen, those impact, and we should actually help the labor sending country to prepare their policy framework, to prepare their social services and community services better to support those children and families. And I know that as labor receiving country like Australia and New Zealand, we don't have legal obligations of doing so, but we do have moral obligations. And we also, internationally, there are consensus in terms of as labor receiving countries, we should be sharing the responsibility of taking intergenerational health and development matters for children and families left behind. So I'll just leave it like that.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Yutong. We really appreciate your contribution. And just to pick up, Henrietta also mentioned in the context of the report that there are, child-specific vulnerabilities that need to be considered in trafficking context and in irregular migration as well. So I think it's always important that we're bringing that into the decision-making and the policy-making. The evidence and the resources are all there. They just need to be constantly brought into the debate. More questions, please. Yes, I see there's 3 in the row. So this gentleman in the black shirt.
This is for Professor Maber. I loved your map, but with all those arrows that came through, there's a very long Indian coastline and none went there. Is there any background to that?
Well, I mean, not every single movement that was in that map. Sometimes when the engines fail or people run out of petrol, they are being pushed by the winds towards India. But the Indian Navy is actually very much alert. And what has been reported by passengers is that India would usually pull them out of their territorial waters and sometimes escort them onwards to Indonesia. So, I mean, there have been some people who ended up in India, but for example, if the Navy or the border patrols were aware of them, they would either equip them with a new boat or send them further south. I think India at this moment in time is definitely not a good place for Rohingya to go. We know there's about 40,000 Rohingya living in India, but they face everyday risk of detention and deportation. And just to bring up a case that happened a few months ago, Indian police arrested people from a refugee camp, Rohingya, and asked them where you want to go, back to Myanmar or you want to go to Indonesia. And people actually said, like, well, can you please bring us to Indonesia? They were put on a boat, spent a couple of days on the boat, and they weren't brought to Indonesia, but they were actually brought back to Myanmar, but not as in handed over to the local authorities, but they were put into a life vest and discarded into the water. And a few people survived, and that's why we know. The case is supposed to go to the Indian High Court, but at the moment we don't know whether the court will be accepted or the court will accept the case or not. So India is definitely not a good place. So that explains why there wasn't really a big file directing towards India. And the file that the arrow that pointed to Sri Lanka was in a way like a arrival by accident. It was not an intended destination. It was, again, because of a breakdown of the infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lady in the green shirt.
Hi, my question's for Henrietta. So when you were doing your research, how much or did you find any links between irregular migration and transnational organised crime? And I'm particularly thinking about like the HIV crisis out of Fiji in particular, but also some of the issues with like medical and health issues that are starting to appear too. So did that feature a lot, or was it something that wasn't linked as much given the time frame? 24.
Thanks for the question. It wasn't something we were particularly looking for according to the themes that were being provided. But in terms of irregular migration in the Pacific Islands region, most of it is air-based. It's through airlines rather than via boat. And there isn't a lot of it. That isn't to say there isn't any, it just there isn't a lot of it. What we did see in terms of irregular migration linked to transnational crime was definitely related to the scam centre in Palau. There had previously been one in Fiji, but it appears that that has closed down. But that is definitely a trend that's worth keeping an eye on and making sure that doesn't continue. Yeah.
Thank you. So there are two questions at the back.
My question is for Ryan. I understand that the PALM scheme is specifically for unskilled and low-skilled workers, and construction is most likely a skilled profession. Why do you think construction can be included in the PALM scheme?
Thank you. Good question. I was just spitballing that one. So this is really one for discussion that we could work out how it could be. Construction has different degrees of skill, I think, right? You've got the labourers, you've got people that are doing skilled trades. I've just gotten back from Tonga a few weeks ago. A lot of people before they come are already working in construction, and they do that when they do get here. So this goes back to, I think, the broader discussion, which I do not have answers to, I wouldn't claim to yet, but there's a real demand for them to link up the skills transfer question a lot more around the program and the scheme back home. And I don't have all that much optimism about all the work that has been done so far on this front and how. But for aged care workers, for example, those that are coming over here in disability care and elsewhere, when you compare their earnings with those that are working in, say, the abattoirs, they're about like 30–40% more. And so colleagues in aged care will say a lot of those exploitation issues doesn't occur in health. It's not true. But there are these big sort of, it can be more diverse than it was. When the PLS was conceived, it wasn't supposed to be sector specific. It was supposed to be open across all sectors and across most skill levels as it was conceived. But then it's sort of the way that it was program managed, I didn't say micromanage, I said program managed, led to it then being done on a sector by sector specific basis in terms of certain agreements. And this has had, we're talking about unintended consequences before, people who are approved employers that then will form into sub-firms so they can work across the different sectors under different deeds and so forth. So why construction? I think there seems to be a pretty obvious need, and it's one of those ones that to me has just popped up in consultations out in the region as an area that would make a lot of sense. And there seems to be a fair bit of interest in where people are pretty comfortable doing the work and be doing that back home, would learn new skills in Australia and be able to take that back home. We've got people do go back and try and start businesses in what they've been doing over here abroad. And we need to probably think a little bit harder in which areas that would make sense. It can't all be tourism, trades and managers and so forth, which there's a little bit more of some of them emerging, but this is one where they're one of the biggest sort of investments that we see back home. I say investment because it's not necessarily a particularly productive investment, is one of the first things that people do with their remittances is build an extra dwelling on their property, and then perhaps another one for the family. And so they're upgrading their properties, and there is a lot of construction, and then that was also flowing through these towns. So that's one area where there are quite obvious spillovers and demand effects that could then be used on return. And there's a lot of demand, at least in certain countries, to be able to link up that reintegration journey a bit better. So construction to me seems to tick all those buckets, and one that would be worth exploring further. And especially skilled trades, like skilled trades in Australia can do really well, as we know. Most of my Pacific Islander friends from high school are tradespeople and more than me as an academic. And it to me seems like an obvious way to push.
Thank you.
Can I just
Yeah.
add to that, in that New Zealand had a really successful construction pilot, particularly post the 2011 earthquake, that brought in seasonal workers from Fiji, Tonga and Samoa, and it was very, very successful in terms of the rebuild of Christchurch.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, so just the lady who has the mic.
I'm keeping on the palm topic, sorry. I'm just interested to know more about the family accompaniment and how it's kind of been determined to be a success. Like, do we have rates of participation and numbers of families that have been reunited, or any other factors that have determined that?
There's an evaluation on the website. As an academic, I wouldn't dare to assess other people's evaluations and studies because I want to make friends and be nice. But I would say, yeah, I would say read that one. But in the first instance, but it's overwhelmingly pretty positive. The critical concern around it, which I certainly cautioned about this at the outset, was when you do a pilot, you need to do your pilot in a way that it's going to be scaled and testing the thing that's going to get rolled out. You don't want to do it as in the RCT literature, we call this a gold-plated one, where you go and do some pilot in a particular way or with a particular NGO, and then you scale it up, and you can't do it at the same cost. It looks really different in practice. This is understandably what has happened with this pilot and a lot of other pilots, pre-departure ones. A lot of pilots associated with the PALM scheme are done in this way that don't at the moment have a clear path to scale, and it's a challenge. For the family accompaniment, I'm not convinced that the scale up would look the same as the results from the pilot, which are pretty positive. But I think the case for ending family accompaniment is a human rights one and a dignity-based one, whereas other visas can choose. It's just a matter of consistency, and it never should have been in place in the first place, in my view. So I'm happy to use the evaluation to support that, but it's a much simpler thing to me in that regard.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm mindful of the time. Sorry, Alan. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
just before you
Yeah,
finish,
no
I
worries.
just wanted to contradict one piece of fake news from Ryan. We're absolutely honoured to have you back this year. Thank you also so much to Antje for coming in on short notice. I'm really honoured to have all of you on this panel. So fake news. Don't believe Ryan's being too modest as usual.
Yeah, well, no, I was just going to close the panel, but I think we might have just closed it. Basically, I just really wanted to extend my thanks to all of the panelists for their excellent presentations. They really did shine a light on some of the most pressing issues in our region. It's a region that is defined by migration, and it's a region with which Australia's future is so deeply connected. So it's like all of the issues that we've discussed today are incredibly important to Australia. So please join me again in thanking the panelists. And I'd now like to hand over to David Knight, Chief of Mission for IOM Australia, to offer some comments and a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Good afternoon all. My name's David Knight. I'm the Chief of Mission for IOM in Australia. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I think we can all agree it's been a really interesting, fascinating conversation that we've had. On the agenda, I'm down to give a vote of thanks. And I have to say, in my long career, I've never done a vote of thanks before. And I was asking Rasika, what do I do? And I had this long list of names that was provided to me, and I'm like, I'm not going to read out 20 names. So I apologize in advance if I don't name you. But what I'd like to do is really give a big thanks to all of the panelists and the facilitators that we've had today, and for all of you for your active engagement. I think We were particularly fortunate this morning to have Ministers Thistlethwaite and Hill join us. I think their reflections really reminded us that migration is not simply a policy challenge, but it is a defining feature of Australian identity and our social fabric, and it's really a key to our future prosperity. Minister Hill discussed the rise of misinformation and harmful anti-migration narratives, both in Australia and globally. And this really at a time when for many OECD countries, Australia included, migration has never actually been more important. We spoke during the course of the day of the really significant skills gaps that we have. I think one of the participants spoke of already it being too late to address some of those skills gaps. And the question really is how bad it will be. We spoke a lot also about the importance of evidence and data. And obviously in a room full of academics and policy practitioners, that's hardly unsurprising. And it's certainly key that we have good data, and it's positive to see how evolving data sets are being developed to help us understand migration and the positive impact. But I think at the same time, we also recognise the limitations of data. And in an environment that is increasingly contested and where alternative facts can be used increasingly in this discussion, I think we need to be careful as sort of practitioners and those really on the inside that we don't rely solely on data when we speak to the positive impact of migration. We can see, and we've seen it in other countries, how a simple narrative can really undermine extensive data. And I fear that if we as practitioners focus solely on data in prosecuting these arguments, we will actually fail. We have to be better at, I think, telling the stories and providing a human face to the migrants in this country and their positive contribution. We have to always remember that behind every migrant, behind each statistic, there is a story, a person and a family. And I think we really need, as a community, to lead into these stories to reinforce the positive impact of migration in Australia. What migration brings to Australia, its potential to contribute to development and stability in our region, cannot be measured only in economic terms. While economic growth is critical, prosperity is broader than GDP and remittances, and migration is essential to social transformation, protection, and progress as it is to economic growth. I'd like to use this opportunity also just to put a small plug in for the International Migration Review Forum. Some of you may be aware of that. It happens under the auspices of the Global Compact on Migration. Dates have now been set for the next the second International Migration Review Forum, which will take place in New York in May next year. Many of you would be aware that Australia is not actually a signatory to the Global Compact on Migration. However, Australia has been an active participant throughout its development and review processes, and the IMRF will be an opportunity for states, including Australia, and stakeholders to come together to discuss many of the issues raised today at a global level. Such dialogue, global, regional, and national, like we've had today, is more important now than ever. So I'd like to extend a special thanks to the ANU for hosting today's event, and in particular ANU's leadership, and to the ANU Migration Hub for bringing us together to exchange these ideas, forge new connections, and engage in dialogue focused on a forward-looking approach to migration in Australia. A special thanks to Alan and Maya Raymond from the Migration Hub for their enormous effort in organising today's proceedings, together with all of you in the steering committee, comprising colleagues from ANU, the Department of Home Affairs, and colleagues in my team in Canberra from IOM. I'd also like to thank the volunteers from the Migration Hub, the National Security College, and the Department of Home Affairs who have helped out today. It's been a pleasure for IOM Australia to collaborate with the Migration Hub and the Department of Home Affairs to deliver today's event. And finally, from my side, in terms of this vote of thanks, a special thanks to all of you for your active participation, your wonderful questions, your insights, and your observations. And with that, I'll hand over to Alan for the final concluding remarks. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. As we bring day one to a close, I just wanted to extend my sincere thanks to everybody for contributing, adding to David's thanks, for being part of this rich, thoughtful, and I found it really energizing discussion. I think today has showcased the very best of what an evidence-based national conversation about migration can look like. We've heard from senior leaders across government, from world-class researchers, international experts, practitioners, and community voices. And each session, from global trends to data innovation, from immigration outcomes to mobility in the Asia Pacific, has really reinforced just how interconnected and consequential migration is for prosperity, cohesion, and future identity in Australia. To our speakers and panelists, thanks so much for your clarity, for the candor, your generosity in sharing your expertise and that you've accumulated over decades of practice and research and leadership. To our sponsors, the Department of Home Affairs, and our partners for multiple years, the IOM, David, Rasika, and the team in the Department of Home Affairs, Shubra and Alex and Deepa, and also to Jeremiah and others who have come along to hand out mics and help out. Isabel, thanks so much. And to the Migration Hub team, to everyone who's volunteered. I should give thanks, first of all, to Lawrence Brown, who's the initiator of the idea for the Migration Update years ago now. I'm not sure if Lawrence is still here, but thank you, Lawrence, we're still going. To Anisha, to everyone who's volunteered from the Migration Hub, thank you so much for contributing to this day. And most of all, to Maya Raymond. You've done a terrific job. Maya is just graduated from ANU. She's part of the Australian National Internships Program. She's done a parliamentary internship recently, and so I assume she'll be on the job market soon. Can I give her the strongest possible reference? She has been an outstanding live wire in putting together this event, and it's been a real privilege to work with her, and we have a small token of thanks for her work on this. Okay, so I also wanted to acknowledge the many ANU colleagues across colleges and schools and professional teams who supported today's event and who are going to support tomorrow's event. The update is a pretty significant undertaking each year. It represents the best of our university working in partnership across disciplines, across sectors, and across borders. I also wanted to say that what stood out to me today is the shared recognition of the fact that Australia is navigating a pretty historic moment of renewal in migration policy and practice. The system is being modernised to meet some profound geopolitical, demographic, technological, and environmental transformations of the 21st century. And that's really challenging work, but it's also full of opportunity. The insights that were shared by people today will play, I think, a meaningful role in shaping how Australia thinks about migration in the future. And tomorrow here at ANU, we're going to continue that conversation. Day 2 moves into a more focused workshop format, bringing together a smaller group of senior leaders for a dedicated Futures session facilitated by our colleagues at the ANU Futures Hub within the National Security College. While that workshop is invitation only due to the highly interactive format, it builds directly on the foundations that all of you have helped to shape today through the discussions that we've had. The themes, evidence, the provocations and questions that emerged across today's panels will feed into that forward-looking discussion. And importantly, the outcomes of tomorrow's workshop won't sit behind closed doors. of course, anonymised under the Chatham House rule. They will flow back into the wider Migration Hub community of practice. They'll inform future events and publications. They'll contribute to the long-term national conversation that we're building together. So whether you're returning tomorrow or concluding your participation today, you're very much part of this ongoing effort, an effort to ensure that Australia's migration system continues to support prosperous, cohesive, and globally engaged futures for Australia. Two small sort of not housekeeping but bonus announcements. One is we didn't want to waste any of the catering, so there are boxes of uneaten food outside that people are welcome to take home. Maya will help you to find those. The team over here will help you to find those. Help yourself. Another is that we're having a small gathering at Symposium, which is in the Canberra district on campus. It's maybe a 15 or 20-minute stroll across campus from here. We have about a dozen spots left there for drinks and canapes. So if you're interested in joining us, please do come up and see me. We can't go too much over our limit of 30, but I'm sure they won't mind if we get a few in. So please, you are very welcome. Just come and let me know so that we can keep track of numbers. So once again, thank you for your time, your insight, for your commitment. Safe travels home this evening. Looking forward to the conversations and collaborations that are going to continue beyond today.